So here it is. Dr. Stephen Lulich, my good friend, has been a part of the IU scholarly community since 2010, serving as a lecturer, visiting research scientist, and assistant professor, working both in the linguistics, speech, and hearing departments at IU. Prior to coming to Bloomington, Stephen worked at Washington University in St. Louis as a research scientist and a lecturer at MIT. He received his bachelor's degree in linguistics from Dartmouth College and his PhD from MIT in speech, hearing, bioscience, and technology. Dr. Lulich has taught a wide variety of courses in the areas of speech, acoustics, research methods, linguistics, including, listen to this title, I love this title, including word crime, language as evidence. That is really cool. And it was an undergraduate course in forensic linguistics, all right? Dr. Lulich has done research on a variety of languages, including Russian, Polish, and an endangered language in northeast China and Siberia, pronounced Orichan, right? Orichan. So if you ever want to find out about that language, talk to Dr. Lulich. Also Hungarian, Brazilian, Portuguese, German, and of course English. He studied classical and Koine New Testament Greek at Dartmouth College, including advanced classes in Homer, Aristophanes, and the New Testament, and has continued to be involved in classical and Koine Greek translations with projects in Homer, Plato, the Apostolic Fathers, Pauline and Johannine epistles, and some of those teaching projects have been in Boston, St. Louis, and in Bloomington. And as a matter of fact, we have the rare privilege of having him as a member of the congregation that I pastor, and he's done Koine Greek classes for us before. So if any of you happen to come to ECC or are interested and want Koine Greek, we can always do it again, because Stephen is not an expert, he says. He says this is his hobby. But anyway, Stephen, have at it. Thank you for coming.
All right, thank you very much. It is true, I'm not an expert, and all of that sounds more impressive than it really is, especially the part about continued participation in translation projects. Those are extremely informal projects. I'm glad to see so many of you here. I'm glad to be here. This is a serious hobby for me, and I really enjoy dealing with issues in Greek New Testament text criticism. And I forget if I said it. Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. So we're talking about textual reliability. What can the Gettysburg Address teach us about the reliability of the New Testament? And we'll see if I can work this thing properly. Okay, I have two specific goals for this presentation. The first one is to provide a practical introduction to issues in Greek New Testament text criticism for an audience that I presume, at least mostly, does not know how to read Greek. Also, I want to provide some resources for you for your own independent critical thinking ability, so you can think about the reliability of the New Testament texts and come to conclusions on your own, even if you do not know Greek. Those are my two goals for this evening. As Bob said, I don't consider myself an expert in this topic. To me, an expert means that you know the ins and outs of a subject, you have bona fide credentials, such as a graduate degree in a relevant field, and you're recognized by other experts in the field as being an expert of the field. I do not meet any of those criteria, and so I think it's important that you all know up front, I am not an expert, sadly, on anything that I'm going to tell you about this evening. So you can make of that what you will. I also want to specify or clarify what this particular presentation is and is not about. We're dealing with the New Testament, of course. And when you deal with the New Testament, a large number of issues rather quickly come up. One of those issues is text criticism. And in text criticism, the kind of question that we might ask is, what was the original text for instance, of the book of Acts. That's a text-critical question. There are issues of authorship, such as, well, who wrote the letter to the Hebrews? Did a different John, besides the Apostle John, write Revelation? Did Paul really write Philippians after all? Those are questions of authorship of the New Testament. There are questions of date. When were the different books of the New Testament written? For instance, when was 1 John written? There are questions about historical accuracy. For instance, did the gospel writers actually get all their details and all their facts right? Or are there true points of misunderstanding or incorrect information that come into conflict when you compare the four gospels? There's the issue of canonicity. Why is Hebrews in the canon, but 1 Clement is not in the canon? Should the Gospel of Thomas be in the canon? Should Revelation be out of the canon? Those sorts of questions deal with the issue of canonicity. And finally, authority. Do these texts have authority over me, over my beliefs and behaviors? Now, those are all very important, in my opinion, and very interesting issues to talk about. But this event is about text criticism specifically. Because while I would not claim to be an expert in any of these topics, the topic that I feel least unexpert in is text criticism. And that's what we're going to focus on today. If you have questions or want to raise points about these other issues in the Q&A, that's fine with me. I'm happy to discuss those. Also, I think Bob and Dan, who's not back yet, will also be happy to contribute to those sorts of questions. That's fine. But the focus of the presentation is on text criticism. I don't have to go to the keyboard because I've got this handy-dandy thing. So here's our outline. We're going to start by talking about the Gettysburg Address. What more natural place to start when you want to learn about Greek New Testament criticism? We'll talk about things like the fact that there are different manuscripts. What are they? What are they like? We'll talk about the types of variants that we observe across these different manuscripts and how many variants we observe. We'll then talk for just 2 slides about a critical apparatus. What is a critical apparatus? And why do we care? Third, we'll talk about the Greek New Testament itself. We'll talk about the different manuscripts, the type of variants, the number of variants. Finally, we will talk about English translations of the Greek New Testament and the kinds of variants that arise there, and how the Greek variants and the English variants are similar to one another. Okay? So the emphasis here, because I'm guessing most of you do not know how to read Greek, and therefore most of you do not have meaningful access to the primary source material, the actual Greek New Testament manuscripts. You need something that can help you think about those things. And the more English that something is, the better, since that's the native language here. So the Gettysburg Address and the Greek New Testament, those are the 2 big parts of this presentation. And we'll have shorter parts on the critical apparatus and the English translations. And I have a few spoilers that I want to get out of the way. First of all, the types and number of variants in the Gettysburg Address manuscripts, the Gettysburg Address manuscripts, are similar to those in the Greek New Testament manuscripts. If you have a good handle on how the different Gettysburg Address manuscripts vary from one another, you also have a good handle on how the New Testament Greek texts vary from each other. Secondly, the individual variants in the English translations of the New Testament are similar to those in the Greek New Testament. If you want to know more specifically about the New Testament in Greek, you can look at English translations and get a very good feel for what kinds of variants are present in the Greek texts and how important those variants are. So finally, are the New Testament documents reliable? That's our big question. At the end of this presentation, I hope that you will be in a position to decide for yourselves, but I will add, I personally think that they are very reliable. This is just information about sources. The Gettysburg Address stuff that I'm going to talk about is not secret. It's not hidden anywhere. You can do a Google search for Gettysburg Address manuscripts and find out all sorts of interesting stuff. And stuff like this. There are 5 handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address, handwritten by Abraham Lincoln. The oldest copy is the Nicolai copy. Nicolai was one of Lincoln's personal secretaries, and he gave this copy to Nicolai after delivering the address. It was written probably immediately before Lincoln actually gave his remarks at Gettysburg. It is very likely the copy that Lincoln was still making edits to and holding in his hand as he delivered his remarks. That's the Nicolai copy. The Hay copy, Hay was another one of Lincoln's personal secretaries, and Lincoln wrote out a second copy and gave it to Hay shortly after delivering the address. The address, by the way, was given on November 19, 1863. Then, immediately after delivering his remarks, Edward Everett, who was actually the keynote speaker at the Gettysburg dedication, Edward Everett asked Lincoln, "Can I have a copy of that speech?" He basically said, "That was so awesome, I want a copy, please give me one." And within a few months, in February, Lincoln sent him one. Lincoln was just making a brief appearance at the Gettysburg Address. The main oration by Everett lasted about 2 hours, and then Lincoln spoke shortly after that, and just for a few minutes. Then there's the Bancroft copy. The Bancroft copy was also handwritten by Abraham Lincoln at about the same time that the Everett copy was written. George Bancroft was a historian of the time, and he asked Lincoln for a copy of the Gettysburg Address that he could give to his stepson, Colonel Alexander Bliss, to be used in a charity fundraiser in Baltimore. Lincoln obliged and sent him off a copy. Unfortunately, in order to be used in the fundraiser, a facsimile copy had to be made, and you could only make a facsimile copy if the front side of the paper had writing on it and the back side of the paper was blank. Lincoln had written on both sides of the paper. So Bancroft had to come back to Lincoln and ask him for a second copy. And this second copy, Lincoln was a little bit more careful about how he prepared it. It is called the Bliss copy. It is written on 2 separate sheets of paper, and it is the only copy of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln actually signed. He signed his name at the end of it. Okay? It is this Bliss copy that is the basis for whatever it was that you may have memorized or learned about when you were in school. It's the Bliss copy that is written in stone, as it were, at the Lincoln Memorial. Okay? And so those are the 5 handwritten copies of the Gettysburg Address. All 5 of them handwritten by Abraham Lincoln within the space of a few months. But there are some other witnesses to the Gettysburg Address, including an eyewitness transcription of the address. You see, there was a reporter at Gettysburg listening to Lincoln's remarks, and this reporter wrote down, word for word, what Lincoln actually spoke. He sent this off to the New York Times, who published it the very next day. Gettysburg Address was delivered on the 19th. It's published in the New York Times the next day, on the 20th. There's also a partial quote of the Gettysburg Address, which was part of a memorial for Abraham Lincoln written by Charles Sumner soon after Lincoln was assassinated the following year. And of course, there's the Lincoln Memorial copy, which is written in stone on the wall of the memorial. It's based on the Bliss copy, but it does have some altered punctuation. Okay? So you have this set of witnesses, if you will, to the Gettysburg Address. The 5 handwritten copies plus the newspaper report, those, in my opinion, are the most important witnesses. But there are others, and there's probably quite a bit more than this. But that's just, as I said, I'm not an expert, and this is a partial list of what I could easily find. This is what the Nicolai copy looks like. Okay, and I wish we had time to read the whole thing. We won't. I presume you're familiar with how the Gettysburg Address goes, so we'll just pick out the highlights. I've circled 5 specific parts of the address where there are interesting things that I want you to notice. First of all, Lincoln is writing on White House stationery in pen, and we get here. I'll start here. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And apparently, at some time after Lincoln had written this out, he went back over it with a pencil and underlined the word the. What the word did. He wants to emphasize in his remarks the contrast between what we say and what they did. He goes on, it is rather for us, the living, to stand here, cross that out, we here be dedicated. It's written in pencil right here. We here be dedicated. Okay, he's making edits. Now, maybe Lincoln originally continued on another sheet of White House stationery, but decided with this edit here that he didn't like what the next page said. Maybe that's what happened. What we know for sure is that when he continued, he was writing on a non-White House stationery piece of paper. It was a piece of paper that somebody had handy. And he continued writing in pen, for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before, dash, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. There are some mistakes in this bit of writing. He forgot to write the word us, the great task remaining before us. So he went back in pen and inserted the word us. He realized he made a mistake there. He decided he didn't like the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. He wanted it to be that cause. So he crossed out the and wrote that over the top of it. He accidentally wrote gave twice. That cause for which they here gave the last full measure, he crosses that out. It looks like that might be crossed out in pencil. It's hard to say. Okay. So again, this is the Nicolai copy. This is the oldest copy. Presumably, this is the copy that Lincoln was still editing right up until the time that he delivered his remarks, and he was holding this copy in his hand. And you can see that he's doing editing as he goes on the same manuscript. Many New Testament Greek manuscripts are just like this. The scribes are writing down, they're copying from some exemplar, copying out a passage of the New Testament, and they're realizing, oh, I made a mistake. I wrote that word twice. Or I forgot to write this whole sentence. I skipped a line. And so they will make notes in the manuscript that make it clear what's going on. Okay? That Nicolai copy, which Lincoln was holding in his hand, presenting, is not the same as the newspaper report, the transcript of what he said. In particular, I put some dots, some red dots at each of the places where there's a difference. And here in the margin is the Nicolai copy. And we see, for instance, that he talked about a final resting place. They're dedicating the part of the battlefield as a final resting place. And here he made it, apparently when he spoke it, he said the final resting place. Let's see here. A resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live, instead of that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. That's not what he wrote in the Nicolai copy. He wrote, this we may in all propriety do. It's a little bit more substantial of a difference, but it means the same thing. Instead of saying above our poor power to add or detract, he just said our power to add or detract. Instead of saying while the world can never forget what they did here, he said but. I'm going to come back to this part in a moment. Down here, that the nation shall under God have a new birth of freedom, and that governments of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. That's different from what he wrote in the Nicolai copy, which said, which didn't have the under God part. The nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Assuming that the transcript is reliable, Lincoln actually delivered slightly different remarks than what we have in writing. Which text is the original? Is it what he wrote down and meant to read? Is it what he actually said with some off-the-cuff modifications? Does it matter that much? I don't have to answer those questions because you can think about it for yourselves and decide whether you think it's that big of a deal. There's a bigger issue here. This section right here, this is where that page break happened, where he changed stationery. In the Nicolai copy, it says, it is rather for us, the living, we here be dedicated, for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. But what he actually said is longer. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work. Okay, the transcriber had a problem, or the printer had a problem and said refinished work. That should be unfinished work, pretty clearly. It's for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to that great task remaining before us. And then it picks up and is in agreement with the Nicolai copy. Okay, so there's an extra phrase that Lincoln spoke that he did not write down in his original Nicolai copy. I would love to spend lots of time looking at all 5 of the handwritten copies, but we won't do that. We'll just sort of sum everything up. There are 5 handwritten copies. There are corrections on 2 of the manuscripts, the Nicolai copy and the Hay copy. There's a newspaper transcript, there's a partial quotation, there's a memorial plaque. Every one of these different versions differs from all the others. No 2 of them are exactly the same. Some of the variants are minor, a final resting place instead of the final resting place. Some are more substantial. This we may in all propriety do, versus it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Some of the variants are even more substantial yet, such as the omission of that phrase that includes thus far so nobly advanced. Okay? Among the 7 main manuscripts, not including the corrections or the partial quote, you can count the number of words in the Gettysburg Address. We have a concert going on. Sounds pretty good. There are 271 words in the Gettysburg Address, and you can count them, there are 143 variants. That's a rate of 143 divided by 271 divided by 7 manuscripts, 0.075 variants per word per manuscript. Okay? Just hang on to that number for now. We'll see it again later. This is an indicator of how variable the manuscripts are. The bigger that number, the more variable. The smaller that number, the less variable. I'm realizing I don't have a clock that I can easily see. Oh boy. A critical apparatus. What is a critical apparatus? Very quickly, a critical apparatus is something that we use to take all of these variants across these manuscripts and have them all neatly organized together so you can see at a glance what's going on. There are lots of New Testament critical apparati. As far as I know, I'm the only one who has made a Gettysburg Address critical apparatus. This is what it looks like. You've got the text up on top. That is what I consider to be the best text, the best version of the text, whatever you think that means. There are footnotes every time there's a variant, and in the footnotes, it spells out what the variant is that I chose, and which manuscripts contain that variant, and what the variant is in another manuscript, or however many variants there are. Here's the big one where the phrase about the thus far so nobly advanced is not there. And so you can see that's what it looks like. And a Greek New Testament text looks very similar. There's what the scholars think is the best text, and then there are the footnotes that tell you about all the variants. Okay, that's a critical apparatus. Just hang on to that. We'll come back to that. We are ready to talk about the Greek New Testament. Again, sources. I brought all of these sources. They're right up here. If you're interested in pursuing this a bit further on your own time, we'll just go on from there. First of all, with the Greek New Testament, we have way more manuscript copies than we do for the Gettysburg Address. On the other hand, the copies we have of the Gettysburg Address are complete, and most of the copies that we have of the New Testament are fragmentary. Some of them are very complete, some of them are much smaller. And this is a graph of the number of known manuscripts as a function of what year it is. So back when the King James translation was made, the Textus Receptus was at the time the best Greek text available, and it was based on about this many Greek manuscripts. 4. Okay? In addition to a number of back translations from the Latin Bible, where Erasmus did not have Greek manuscripts for those texts. So since then, the number of manuscripts discovered has skyrocketed. We now have more than 5,000 manuscripts. And for instance, the 4th revised edition of the United Bible Society's Greek text, which is basically the basis of all of the modern translations, like the English Standard Version, that's based on more than 5,000 texts, 5,000 manuscripts. There are some particularly important manuscripts that are pretty much complete. They are the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus, all 3 written in the 4th, 5th centuries. All 3 available online for your perusing pleasure. You can go to these websites, or you can look in Google and find these websites where you can actually look at digital copies of every page in these codices. These are extremely important codices. They are very early, they are very professionally made, and they are extremely complete. Old Testament and New Testament. Now, they're not the earliest manuscripts that we have, though. The earliest manuscripts are more fragmentary, and they are pieces of paper written on papyrus. Okay, these are some of the earliest. They have a P in front of them to indicate that it's a papyrus manuscript rather than what we would normally think of as paper or animal skins, vellum. These manuscripts represent almost all of the New Testament. Other early manuscripts represent most of the rest, and only 1st and 2nd Timothy are not represented by any papyrus manuscripts that we know of. This is the oldest known Greek New Testament manuscript. It's called P52. It's also called the John Rylands manuscript. It dates to somewhere between about 100 and 125 AD, and it is a portion of the Gospel of John. This is the front side, and then you turn it over and it's written on the back side as well. If you know how to read Greek, you can actually look at it and you can find out what it's talking about. And people have done that, and I can look at it and I can agree with what real experts have said. This is talking about Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. That's what this part of whatever larger manuscript this was part of, that's what this is talking about. And it's dated to probably within 30 or 40 years of when the Apostle John actually wrote the Gospel according to John. It's very early. This is another section of the same part of John from a different manuscript, slightly younger, more recent manuscript, P90. This is, this one was toward the end of the 2nd century, so close to the year 200. In about the year 200, we have the beginning of John written like this. This is much more complete. A little bit later, we have the end of Luke right here, and then the beginning of John right here. Very nice, readable copies. This is the Codex Sinaiticus, the beginning of John's Gospel. And you can see it's written in 4 columns. It's very professionally done. It's very neat. And it is very complete. We talked about minor, slightly less minor, and more major variants in the Gettysburg Address. We can do that with the Greek New Testament as well. I want to draw your attention in particular to Acts 20, verse 28. This is what the English Standard Version says. Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. This is Paul talking. Okay? This Church of God, that's how the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus and at least 19 other manuscripts that we know of represent this phrase. On the other hand, P74, an early papyrus, Codex Alexandrinus, and at least 25 other manuscripts have Church of the Lord. Is Paul talking about the Church of God? Is he talking about the Church of the Lord? Which one is what Paul actually wrote, and which one maybe is a scribal error? We don't know. Is that a big deal? Personally, I'm not very bothered by that. They mean the same thing. Here's a little bit bigger variant. In Acts 18:21, the ESV says, on taking leave of them, Paul said, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. The P74, the Codex Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, and at least 15 others have that version. But at least 10 other manuscripts have a longer version. On taking leave of them, he said, it is necessary by all means to celebrate the coming feast day in Jerusalem. But I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. This comes from the Codex Bezae. And I wasn't thinking about it this way, but I guess this is proof for you that I do know how to read Greek, because I translated that myself. Okay. Is that a big deal? Personally, I'm not that worried about it. There are bigger variants, bigger issues in the New Testament. 2 of them in particular. One of them is John 7:53 to 8:11. It's the story of the woman caught in adultery. And I have quotes here from reputable sources, such as what I've got up here at the front. The evidence for the non-Johannine origin of this pericope of the adulteress is overwhelming. Okay? For instance, let me skip down here. This story of the woman caught in adultery is not always in the same place in all of the early manuscripts. It comes after John 7:52 in most manuscripts, but it also comes after John 7:36, after John 7:44, after John 21:25, and after Luke 21:38. Some manuscripts place this story toward the end of the Gospel of Luke. Metzger says, at the same time, the account, this account of the woman caught in adultery, has all the earmarks of historical veracity. It's obviously a piece of oral tradition that circulated in certain parts of the Western Church and was subsequently incorporated into various manuscripts at different places. And another quote, significantly enough, in many of the witnesses that contain the passage, it is marked with asterisks or obeli, indicating that even though the scribes included it, they were aware that it lacked satisfactory credentials. The Greek New Testament manuscripts that include the story of the woman caught in adultery include asterisks. The scribes who wrote it knew that it wasn't original to John's Gospel. On the other hand, as Metzger said, it has all the earmarks of historical veracity. From Eusebius' History of the Christian Church, he talks about a man named Papias, an ancient man who was a hearer of John, There's controversy over what exactly that means, but we'll just go with it. Papias gives in his own work, other accounts of the words of the Lord on the authority of Aristian, an early disciple, and he gives accounts of the traditions handed down by the presbyter John, who I think is the Apostle John. And he relates another story of a woman who was accused of many sins before the Lord, which is contained in the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which we do not have anymore. It was not included in the canon. We do not have a copy of this Gospel according to the Hebrews. We only know that certain early church fathers knew it existed. Don't you just wish we had that so we could know what it was about? This is a very old story and probably is historically accurate. It probably really happened. John apparently did not include it in his gospel. But it was known, and at some point later, people, scribes, scholars, thought, this is important. We know that John wrote it. We know it happened. Let's just put it in a relatively undisruptive location within the Gospel of John. And then there's variation in terms of where they thought it was least disruptive. That's a big variant in the Greek New Testament. Another big variant is the ending of Mark. There are multiple endings to Mark, most of which do not exist in the earliest and best manuscripts. But your Bible has all of them, usually marked by asterisks or square brackets to indicate that we don't actually know if this is original. I would love to talk more about that, but time is short. Okay. Of the approximately 5,000 Greek manuscripts that we have for the New Testament, no two agree exactly. It's just like the Gettysburg Address. On the other hand, it is quite easy to demonstrate that the amount of agreement among the editions of the New Testament is greater, far greater, than has generally been recognized. That far greater is in the book here. Nearly two-thirds of the New Testament texts are in complete accord. About 66%, 63%, something like that, of all of the verses in the New Testament have zero variants. Any variants that exist are in other verses. The Greek New Testament of about 1715 has about 5,000 differences from the critically reconstructed New Testament of today. The total number of words in the Greek New Testament is about 137,490, approximately, right? That's 5,000 differences right here, divided by the number of words, 0.036 variants per word for the Greek New Testament. Okay? And you can compare that directly with this number for the Gettysburg Address, 0.036 versus 0.075. There are fewer variants in the Greek New Testament than there are in the Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address is a more problematic text than the Greek New Testament is. That brings us to English translations. There are many English translations of the New Testament. I'm only going to highlight 3 of them for specific reasons. The King James Version, written or produced in 1611, was based on a poor Greek text, which relied on 4 or 5 Greek manuscripts and some back translation from Latin. Okay? The New King James Version, which was produced in 1982, it uses the same basic text, but it simply updates the language and makes it more comparable to modern translations. The English Standard Version is one of the most recent translations, 2001, and it is based on the current best Greek text. And here's an example. In the King James, the New King James, and the ESV for Acts 18:21, which I already told you about. The KJV and the New King James are basically the same. He took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return to you again, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. The ESV says, on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills, and he set sail from Ephesus. Earlier, I wrote this up as a translation out of the Codex Bezae. Okay? Now I'm writing it up here as a directly from the ESV. Okay? So you can actually compare like the New King James and the ESV, and this tells you exactly what the variants in that verse are in the Greek New Testament texts, except it's in English. Isn't that nice? If you want to know how the Greek New Testament texts differ from each other, you can compare the New King James and the ESV translations. Or you can use other translations. It doesn't have to be the ESV. It could be RSV, NASB, any of those. But compare it with the KJV or the NKJV. Comparisons between these will give you a very good sense of the degree to which the best manuscripts vary from the poorest manuscripts. Almost all of the variants are very minor and do not affect the meaning at all. Some variants are more substantial, but still do not substantially change the meaning or the overall point. They simply give some clarification or some context. That is especially the case in the book of Acts. There are two major variants that are not reflected in the English translations. Those are the woman caught in adultery and the endings of Mark. Whether it's the King James or the ESV, you're going to have both of those. You're going to have the woman caught in adultery and you're going to have the endings of Mark. The translations don't differ in how they deal with those questions. Here's our outline. We're at the end. The Gettysburg Address is an excellent model for understanding the ways in which manuscripts vary from one another. The types of variants and the number of variants among the Gettysburg Address manuscripts are very similar to the types and number of variants among the Greek New Testament manuscripts. And furthermore, the comparison of Old and New English translations of the Greek New Testament provide a very good representation of the ways in which the Greek New Testament manuscripts themselves vary one from another. So the Gettysburg Address is a model that tells you roughly what the Greek New Testament is like. But the English translations tell you more precisely about the different texts. There are still lots of issues that have to be dealt with. What do you do, really, with the story of the woman caught in adultery or the endings of Mark? Lots of other issues that we have not talked about that scholars have brought up. I'm going to just skip over this. Not because I want to, skip over it, but we're out of time. Finally, again, this question, are the New Testament documents reliable? I hope that with this introduction to the Gettysburg Address and to the English translations of the Greek New Testament and to how a critical apparatus works, that you are now in a better position to think about claims that people may make or questions that you may have about the reliability of the New Testament documents. I would like for you to be able to decide for yourselves whether you think the New Testament documents are reliable. I personally am pretty persuaded that they are very reliable, and that's where we will leave that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's actually not far off.
Yes, you were on the money, actually, because we started late. So it's time for Q&A. Any questions you have, direct them to Stephen. And if he doesn't like them, maybe he'll direct them to me, and if I don't like them, we'll say only God knows, right? Or something like that. So go right ahead, Stephen, take it away.
What are the characteristics that are attributed to the, I think you had good and poor, or best and worst?
What makes it good or poor?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question just to make sure that's on the film. The question is, what is it that characterizes a good text versus a poor text? And there are a number of factors that go into that. The most broad brushstroke version of my answer would be the best manuscript, or the best texts, the best versions of the text are the versions that are best attested across a large number of manuscripts, especially those manuscripts that are more complete, manuscripts that are more professionally done, that don't have lots of corrections, manuscripts that are independent from one another. There are times when we know that manuscript A and manuscript B were both copied off of manuscript C. Okay, so manuscript A and B are related to each other. That doesn't, if they agree with each other, that doesn't count for as much as if we had manuscript A and manuscript D, which we know comes from a different exemplar, and if those agree, that counts for more. Okay, so it's a complicated question. How do you decide what is the best text? It's similar to trying to decide what is the best text of the Gettysburg Address. And what scholars do is they take the materials that they have, they sift through them, and based on any number of pieces of evidence, they come to a rough consensus on what the best version of the text is. Okay. Yeah, well, that's probably about as deep as I can go into that. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah. Let other people talk. I've got a question.
Okay, yeah.
Other people.
Yeah.
The 5,000 manuscripts, is that just 5,000 papyrus, and then after a while they stop using papyrus, or is that before the year 500, or what's the cutoff on that?
The cutoff is when the printing press came about, basically. Okay, so 5,000 manuscripts that are handwritten manuscripts.
Okay.
Of those, there are maybe 150, maybe 200, somewhere in that range, papyri manuscripts. Those are very old. It was back in the first few centuries when papyrus was the form of paper that people wrote on the most. And then there, more recently, between say 400 AD and 1400 AD, the writing material is different, the handwriting changes, the form changes rather than being, the Christians who were making these copies very early on adopted a modern book form. It's called a codex, and it's a bound book. It's not a scroll. And most people used scrolls back in the day. And the Christian literature was sort of groundbreaking and trailblazing in that way by really making use of the codex instead. So the form of the books maybe changed a bit, but the Christians are using codices very early. The material that it's written on changes, the handwriting changes, but we have these 5,000 manuscripts that cover a little more than 1,000 years of scribal activity. Okay, many of those manuscripts are related to each other, which means they carry less weight as independent witnesses to the text. But and that's one of the reasons why the manuscripts that I specifically pointed out, the three major codices and the papyrus manuscripts, they carry a lot of weight nowadays because they are considered to be more independent witnesses. Okay, and there's not 5,000 of those. There's a few hundred of those.
I guess the other question, is the 5,000 just Greek, or does it include Latin translations from like 1,200?
I believe it's just Greek, so that's not counting translations. Yeah, I might be wrong about that, but I think that's right. Yeah.
Do you distinguish between reliable transcriptions and whether what's reliable transcription is factually accurate? And does it make a difference to you that the first original that you have is 100 years after the events happened for the New Testament versus written in Lincoln's hand for the Gettysburg Address?
So that's two different questions, I think. Let me start with the second one. What difference does it make that with the Gettysburg Address, the copies we have are all written in Lincoln's own hand, versus in the Greek New Testament, the earliest copies we have are, for Papyrus P52, it's maybe 30, 40 years after John wrote the Gospel. Most of them are 100 years, 200 years, or more after the New Testament writers actually wrote their New Testament books. And does that make a difference? It does. Okay, Lincoln's handwriting is Lincoln's handwriting. It raises the question, the fact that you can have multiple copies by the same person raises the question whether that could be true of New Testament documents as well. Okay, in particular, the Book of Acts. There are two basic versions of the Book of Acts that are circulating in the early Mediterranean Christian world. one version is longer than the other version. And I can give you a quick visual on how much variation there is by showing you this book. This is a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, and this much of the book is about the four Gospels. Okay, you see that. This much of the book up on top is about everything after Acts, and this much is about Acts. Acts has a lot of variation. Okay, the longer version is, now I don't remember, let's say maybe 10 or 15% longer than the shorter version. So, what happened? Did Luke write the shorter version first and send it off to the East? And then he thought, the Western churches are going to need more clarification of terms and geographical locations. Let me write a new copy, a longer copy that gives those clarifications, and now we'll send that off to the Western churches. That might be what happened. We don't know. What we know is that there's a shorter and a longer version of Acts. Okay? And scholars speculate about which one came first and what was the reason for that. Did Luke write one copy, and some scribe at some point decided this needs more clarification, and that became the standard version of the text in the West? We don't know. It would be awfully nice if we had the original manuscripts from the pen of John and Luke and Matthew and Paul. We don't have those, and so we just have to decide for ourselves whether that is a big problem or not. For me, it's not a big problem because the convergence is, in my opinion, really quite strong. So if I know what the earliest manuscripts say, I feel pretty confident that those manuscripts are not much different in any meaningful way from what Paul originally wrote. Other people come to different conclusions about that. Yeah?
Another thing to consider, you may want to speak to this, is that when you analyze ancient documents, not things like the Gettysburg Address, you find the same thing is true. So for instance, you'll have a handwritten copy of Plato's Republic, nor do you have a handwritten copy from Suetonius, nor Tacitus, nor Aristotle. The list just goes on and on.
Yeah.
So it's not dissimilar at all.
Right, yeah. So in the ancient world, if you think about Homer, the earliest manuscript copy of Homer that we have is from like 1,000 years after Homer actually wrote. All of the classical Greek and Roman authors that we have and that we read and we put on our library shelves, and maybe don't read, I don't know. They sure look good though. The earliest manuscripts we have are from much later. It's not even comparable to what we have for the New Testament. And we have far fewer manuscripts. It might be 8 manuscripts versus 5,000.
For Aristotle, there's 49 manuscripts, and there's a 1,400-year gap between the earliest manuscript and the original.
Yeah. And Aristotle's kind of important.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Are the variants in other ancient documents different from the ones that we see in the New Testament, and if so, how much? Or do you know the answer to that?
I do not know the answer to that question. Bob, do you?
I don't.
No? Anybody else? The question is whether the kinds of variants and the number of variants for those other classical authors are similar to the variants that we see in the New Testament. I do not know.
But in this room, I guarantee you, every one of you could find out.
Yeah.
When they were making copies, were they making massive number of copies of the word from communities?
The question is, when scribes were making copies, were they making lots and lots of copies? It basically was it a factory production kind of a thing? That varied. So there were some scriptoria where you had professional scribes who were sitting copying things out. You had particular notable academic centers in Alexandria and Caesarea in particular, where you had schools of Christian scribes who were copying lots of manuscripts. and studying them and commenting on them. You also had people who were private citizens, just, you know, they went up down to the church, the local church, and they got a copy of the Greek text down, and they said, I really want to copy down this passage for my own use. You had other people who would hire a professional scribe or an amateur scribe to produce for you a complete collection of Paul's letters, okay? And it would be a single copy. So there's a lot of variability in terms of what kind of scribes, whether they were professional or amateur, whether they were scribes at all, and how they were making these manuscripts. Lots of variability.
You made a comment on this too, Stephen, and know the date better than I do, but there's some statistic concerning quotes in the church fathers that if collected, the entire New Testament is in those quotes by the year 250 AD or something like that. I don't know what it is. I don't remember.
I think, correct me if you're wrong, that would be the... Correct me if you're wrong.
We're probably both wrong.
We're probably both wrong. I think it might be that each of the New Testament books is represented, but not the entire New Testament.
Okay.
I don't think the entire New Testament is present in the early church fathers until much later. I might be wrong though. But for questions of canonicity, the New Testament books are quoted from. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So the reading that you gave us with kind of variants for words for manuscripts, would you have any more critical readings that you'd apply, where maybe you get a bigger weight on the hit for, this is the versus that, versus this is a really important concept that was changed in the wording, or maybe there's a frequency of variants in an area of the text versus they're kind of spread out throughout the text, so this area is highly questionable versus...
Yeah, so I think I'm going to answer your question. Tell me if I'm going in a different direction. My understanding, okay, and we are definitely at a point where I'm not an expert. But my understanding, and this is based on, in particular, some comments in Alon's book on the Greek New Testament, is that the distribution of variants across the different New Testament books is roughly uniform. And the distribution of really minor versus less minor variants is similar. Almost all of the variants are really minor variants, okay? And they're spread out roughly equally across the entire New Testament. Less minor variants, more substantial variants, occur much less frequently. I would say they're concentrated in Acts more than in any of the other parts of the New Testament, but other than that, they're kind of spread out in the same sort of way that the minor variants are. Major variants, there's basically two. The woman caught in adultery and the ending of Mark. And maybe it may be that actual experts would say, well, actually there's one or two more really major variants, but those are the two big ones. Did that actually answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Where are those papyrus, the very oldest ones, where are those housed?
Okay. The question is, where are these oldest papyri actually housed? And I don't know offhand for all of them. This one, the very oldest that we have, P52, this is housed, it's part of the John Rylands manuscript collection at the University of Manchester in England. I'm hoping to go to the University of Manchester for a conference in my area of expertise next summer. And if I do get there, I'm paying a visit to this.
Hasn't it traveled though?
All of these manuscripts have traveled. This was not originally discovered in Manchester.
I thought I saw one at Yale, that's why I asked it.
At where?
At Yale, when I was there, I think that one came through.
Oh, it could be, yeah. Typically these manuscripts, so they belong to libraries, and they may go on traveling exhibits from time to time. But they belong to a particular library. This belongs to the University of Manchester Library. Many of these papyri, many of the most important ones, belong to the British Museum and other major museums in Europe, not so much in the United States. But
what are some of the current topics of inquiry within this research community right now?
Okay, so the question is, what are some of the current contemporary topics of inquiry within this research community? My short answer is, I'm not part of that research community, so I don't know. I will tell you that one thing that I am aware of is that this, the notion of the original text is really hotly debated right now. And it doesn't matter if you're a secular scholar or a religious scholar, or specifically Christian scholar, it's a big issue. Does it make sense to talk about an original text? In the church, we tend to say, at least in some branches of the church, we believe that the scriptures are inerrant in the original manuscripts. Okay? Is there such a thing as the original manuscripts? If Luke wrote 2 copies of Acts, which one is the original? Which one do you go with? If the woman caught in adultery is not part of the Gospel of John originally, but it was part of the stories that John told that he was eyewitness to, is it part of the original text or not? And similar issues can be raised for any of these New Testament books. I think by and large, people have settled on acknowledging that the question of the original text is more complicated than we used to think. Okay? Just like I hope the question of the original copy or the original version of the Gettysburg Address is more complicated than you thought before this evening. And people now are talking about the early text of the New Testament instead of the original text. We're now talking about the early text as it existed in all of its various forms in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Okay. So that's one of the big issues. Beyond that, you would have to ask an actual expert. Sam, I realize you had 2 questions. I only addressed one of them.
That's okay.
That's okay. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. One more.
How much did the oral tradition, the oral memorization of text come into play into this?
How much did the oral memorization text? Good question. We or at least I don't know. Of course, none of the books of the New Testament, if we assume that they were written down at the time that the church traditionally has thought they were written down, none of them are written down at the time that Jesus was ministering, right? Or even shortly after that time, within a few years. They're all decades later. Paul's letters are probably the earliest, or among the earliest, about 20 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. So in that time, everything is oral. This stuff is not written down, unless people are writing things down, and those sources perhaps contributed to developing the more official sources. We don't really have a good handle on that. There's a very prominent theory that the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke are related to each other via some unknown previous sources called the Q source, because Q in German stands for Quelle, which means source. The source. Academics are very creative in naming things. So oral transmission of stories certainly happened. We have the evidence that Eusebius gives us, and he's quoting from earlier church fathers, some of which we don't have anymore, that these oral traditions were there, people knew them. Papias was writing them down, probably not the only one, and one of those stories probably is managing to work its way into the official canonical Gospel of John at some point. So that's some discussion of the point without actually being an answer. Yeah, maybe this is, I don't know how much time we have.
Go ahead.
So we're essentially saying chronology of the Gospels is Mark, Matthew, Luke, John.
I'm not making an argument like that. As I understand it, the consensus in the scholarly community is that that is the order: Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. The earlier traditional order is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are some reasons to think that the traditional order is correct. There are some reasons to think that the newer consensus is correct. Again, this is the sort of thing that, let me put it this way. Issues of text criticism of the New Testament and reliability of the manuscripts, those are issues that are more important to me personally, and so those are the issues that I spend my hobby time investigating. The questions of whether Matthew or Mark was written first, I think is interesting. It's not as burning of an issue for me, and so I don't have as much to say about it. And so I think if you really press me, I would say I'd go with the traditional, exactly, Matthew.
Okay, thank you very
All right.
much. We really appreciate it.
What's that? He's telling me secrets.
We want you to, if you haven't already, to sign up for the Trinity Fellowship email list. We have a piece of paper right over here. If you'd be kind enough to put your email on that, we can update you on all events coming up. This is the last one for the year, but we'll begin again in the fall, and we hope to have 3 each semester. We found this room to really be amenable because sometimes we've tried to do stuff in the union, like say for the Pan-Japani room, and it's so big that when we have smaller groups like this, it feels vacuous. This feels really great, so this is our new favorite spot. We'll see if we can get it every time we have a Trinity Fellowship event. But again, thank you for coming. We really appreciate it, and do us the favor of signing up with your email over here. We'd really appreciate it. See you later.
If you would like